Yo, this is DJ Sentinel, and I'm here with
DJ Cheetah.
And DJ, you may get down. We are all at the age where we are about to work, and to be prepared, we enrolled in a program called YWLA, Young Worker Leadership Academy. During the program, we heard stories about people who got hurt on the job. We learned a lot about health and safety rights too. However, we wanted to learn more. We were lucky enough to speak with a UCLA health and safety expert, Kevin Riley, the Director of Labor, Occupational Safety, and Health Program.
What are the most important workplace hazards that people do not know about, sir?
All right. Well, good question to start off with. Most important hazards people don't know about. So let me say a couple things maybe about hazards first, and then I'll answer your question. So, the kind of hazards people face on work is going to be really dependent on the kind of work they're doing, right? It's going to depend on where they work and the kind of tasks that they have there. So think about construction. Maybe the most important hazard is something like falls. Restaurants, maybe it's something like burns or cuts, slips and falls. Healthcare, you got biological. So it's a big question because it really does depend on, the specific places where people are working in. But that being said, I think there's some common hazards we see a lot of places. So one of them is what's called ergonomics. You know that term?
No.
Did you guys talk about that? So ergonomics is how your body position is. So if you're sitting over slumped all day, your shoulders might start hurting. Or if you got a job, yes, dude, now you're all straightening up, right? Or if you got a job where you have to make a repetitive motion again and again and again and again, you do that for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, for a year, 2 years, you're going to get some real serious pain, right? In your muscles and your bones. So those are ergonomic hazards. We see that in a lot of different kinds of workplaces, everything from, construction or factory, even to office settings. People are not sitting properly at their desks. That can cause problems. So that one's really common. You all ask about chemicals. Chemicals can be really common too. And we can talk about that one in a few minutes because I know you got a question about it. And then, the other one I think it's really important for young workers to be aware of, maybe you talked about it during YWLA, is workplace violence. If you have jobs that you're dealing with the public all day, there's a lot of opportunities there to be dealing with, who knows what might be walking into your restaurant, your fast food place, your clothing store, wherever you may be working. So that's something I think a lot of folks don't really think about, but it's something we try and really emphasize that, it's a real thing. And we need to be thinking about how to protect workers from that kind of.
During the pandemic, have you seen any increase in workplace violence?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, we have. We've seen it in a lot of places. I mean, and I bet it's sort of, I can imagine where you're thinking about that. But if you think, for example, about a fast food restaurant, where workers are trying to make sure they've been assigned to make sure everyone's wearing a mask. You get a customer coming in who doesn't want to wear a mask or doesn't want to follow COVID protocols. That worker could become the victim then of some sort of violent outburst that customer can have. And everyone's been stressed. Everyone's been, on kind of high alert the last couple of years. So definitely we've seen a lot of problems there. And it's been in a lot of those workplaces where people are having to deal with the general public, fast food, grocery stores, retail, that kind of thing. There's some workplaces that have done some really creative things to try and prevent violence or to give workers some tools if the situations are happening. So it could be something like installing a barrier, let's say, you see that a lot of times in banks, a barrier between the customer and the worker. That can be a good tool. It's just a simple thing, but it can prevent any sort of physical kind of altercation. Panic buttons are becoming more and more popular, right? You stick a panic button underneath a cash register or underneath the counter at a restaurant. It could be a way to to alert the authorities or alert the manager if something's going on.
It don't want to come from behind the counter.
Say that again.
They do be using that button, mister. When something happen, and they don't want to come from behind the counter.
The button.
Yup, I know the button. Second, can we do the next question?
Sure, yeah. Move on.
All righty. What happens when you are injured at a workplace? What benefits should you receive? Do workers always receive benefits for any work?
All right. A good set of questions. So what happens if you're injured? Number one, all workers, most workers, let's say, there's some exceptions, but most workers have the right to what's called workers' compensation.
Yep, I heard of that.
You heard of that? Great. So that's important to know, because what that means is if you're injured on the job or your job makes you sick, your employer is supposed to pay they pay for workers' compensation. And that is a system that would basically pay you as a worker for whatever medical treatment you might need. Maybe let's say you lose days from work. Maybe, you break a bone, you have to be out of work for a couple of weeks. Workers' comp is supposed to pay you for that time that you're not at work. It can pay for longer term disability if you have a really serious injury. And then even workers' comp will also pay, there's a payout if there's a death on the job. Workers' comp will cover payment to the families as well. So it's a good resource to know about. The problem is workers' compensation, it's a very complicated system. So it can be very hard sometimes for workers to go through that if they're injured. It's hard to navigate. It's like there's a lot of paperwork, a lot of proof that workers sometimes have to provide to show like, hey, this was something that happened to me when I was on the job. If you get a really bad employer, sometimes employers will actually like try and prove that your injury is not work related. I mean, it's kind of crazy, but there are employers who actually hire detectives to go follow injured workers. And they'll be like, hey, yeah, that guy said he hurt his back on the job, but this afternoon I saw him playing basketball with his friends. So clearly he's not injured. So therefore I should have to pay for his injury. It happens all the time. It's really crazy. So it's a really hard system. It's not super friendly, let's say, to workers who are injured, but it is there. And it's a good resource to know about. And yeah, so that's the thing I would say. And when your question about does everyone get it, there's many workers who get injured and never get access to workers' comp. It's because either they don't know about it, or maybe they're afraid to ask for it, because you do have to go to your employer if you're injured. Maybe they're afraid to say anything, or then these intimidation tactics. Maybe that like they're going to be sending a detective out to follow you for the next however many months. Like, who wants to go through that, right? So it's a system that's not particularly well designed for workers. So a lot of people don't end up accessing it because it's really hard. But it is there. It is a right we have.
If your child was a young worker, what would you teach them to ensure they are safe on the job and the rights are protected and they don't get abused?
I have to say, first of all, it's my favorite question. I think it's such a good question. I'm really glad you asked it. So what would I tell my kids? So there's a couple things I think are really important. So one is like work can be dangerous. Number one, like we just tell you often tell people, no, get out, get a job. You got to make, put food on your table, whatever. Work can be dangerous. You need to keep that in mind. Your boss is going to tell you to do stuff. Maybe sometimes that stuff is not particularly smart to do, or maybe it's not particularly safe. That's number one. Number two, I would always say is like, listen, do pay attention to whatever training you're getting on the job, because your boss is supposed to provide health and safety training. So if they're providing that to you, it's really important to pay attention, because you want to make sure you can do your job as safely as possible. And then the other thing I would definitely say is like, yes, you have a responsibility to be safe, but your employer has a responsibility too. So you do your research to figure out what is your employer supposed to be doing for the kind of workplace that you're in to make sure that workers aren't getting hurt. And if they're not doing that stuff, figure out ways to then respond, talk to your coworkers, follow that process we were talking about a few minutes ago.
Yeah.
So really good question, though. I'm glad you asked me that one.
Thank you. You're welcome.
On that wage stuff topic,
Sure.
how common is it, and what can workers do if they're not paid properly?
So I think we're at UCLA, so we do research at the university. There's a lot of other universities that have researched this. I think especially in what we would call low wage jobs, so jobs that are paying kind of minimum wage or just above minimum wage. We see a lot of researchers at UCLA and other places have found it, particularly for low wage jobs, it's really common. Wage theft is really common. People not getting breaks, people working more than 40 hours and not getting paid overtime. Yeah. A lot of that happens. So, or a boss telling a worker like, hey, clock out, but then come back because I got 2 more hours of work for you to do. That's illegal, right? That happens a lot. So I think it's really common particularly in those kind of jobs. What's that?
What could someone do in that situation? Like,
So what does someone do? Right. So then another same kind of thing, like talk to your coworkers. Is it's happening to you? Is it happening to other people? And if it is, okay, let's work together. And then number two is start reaching out to some local groups that you trust. Our program can give a lot of resources, a lot of referrals. There's a lot of good law firms that will provide support for workers around wage theft too.
yeah.
So because it is so common, that's it's something that there's a lot of groups here who are helping workers to figure out.
Yeah.
The seventh question is, do bosses usually provide employees with proper safety equipment and training to be safe at the workplace?
So do they usually do it? All right, here's how I would think about it. Bosses come in all shapes and sizes. You've got some really good bosses that really care about their workers and want to make sure they're safe and they're protected and paid well. And then you've got some really crappy bosses who are just like in it for their own skin. They don't really care about their workers. And then everything in between. So it really, really runs the gamut there. One thing which is really important to think about when it comes to health and safety, even for some of those good bosses, remember, if I'm a boss and I have a factory, let's say, with these big heavy machines, they're pumping out bottles, let's say. I've already spent all this money to get that equipment and to be hiring you all to work those machines. Now I'm thinking, okay, well, the machines could hurt one of you. I could spend more money to put in guards or to maybe slow down the machine so you're less likely to get stuck in them or take these other measures. But that money that I'm investing is now not money that's in my pocket. So there's always, always, always this tension when it comes to health and safety around, like, we want workers to be, the employer may want the worker to be safe, but in order to get there might be a financial cost to the employer. And so are they going to do the right thing and actually invest that money? Or are they going to say, well, you know what, we've been lucky so far. We haven't had any workers have their arms chopped off on that machine. We'll just keep it going, right? Or like, yeah, that worker last week got bleach in his face, but God was on his side. He didn't go deaf. He didn't go blind. So we're good. We don't have to worry about it. It's really easy, even for some of those good employers, to slip into that and think like, we'll cut a few corners here and there. And that's the thing I think it's really important for workers to always be kind of keeping an eye out for, because it's a real slippery slope, right? One day you decide not to put in that guard. The next day, well, let's just speed up that line speed just a little bit more. We can make a little bit more profit. The workers will be fine, on and on and on. So that's, I think, the way we often see it. Yeah, you got your really bad employers who are doing just really crappy stuff, but more often it's like there's these incentives, these financial incentives that are like chipping away at the safety measures that employers may be taking in place.
What is the craziest story you heard about worker abuse?
Yeah. All right. I actually, when I saw this question, I actually did a little research because I wanted to have some statistics for you all. There's a really crazy story that's happened here in LA you may or may not have heard about. Were you all familiar with the Thai garment worker case in El Monte? You ever heard about this? All right, so get this. This was back in the 1990s. There was a family that was running a garment shop. What they were doing was they were smuggling Thai immigrants into the United States. They were bringing them in through the airport. They actually, when they got them to the airport in Los Angeles, they gave them fancy jewelry and clothing so that they looked like they were wealthy tourists. And they told them, all right, come on through, we're going to go through customs. And then once they got through customs, they took all that away from them and they took away their passports. And they brought them to this house in El Monte. And they were running basically a slavery sweatshop there. It was a garment manufacturing facility. So these Thai immigrants were brought in, none of them spoke English. They were not allowed to leave the house. They were forced to work 17, 18, 19, 20 hours a day producing garments. They didn't have any of their papers. Like, the employer took their papers away, so they couldn't, they had no record of who they were, where they were. And this was a huge, huge issue. There were a bunch of worker advocates, worker organizations, and lawyers who figured out what was going on. And it became this huge case. They ended up raiding the house. And I think they found 72 immigrant workers there. basically working as slaves in that house. And it ended up becoming a whole case. You know, there was lawsuits, and as a result, I think in the end, there was $4 million. Well, first of all, the workers were taken out of that situation. They were relocated. They were allowed to settle and have normal lives here. And then there were, through lawsuits, there was, I think, $4 million in the end that those workers won. It was divided among them as compensation for having to go through that. I think, I would say, in my mind, that is the craziest situation. That was right here in our backyard. And, you know, not super long ago,
Yeah.
30 years ago.
Do I guess foreign workers who maybe don't have citizenship, maybe only have like their green card or something like that, do they have all the same worker rights and protections that a full U.S. citizen may have?
Yeah, it's a really good question too. All right, so there's the law and then there's reality. If let's say you're an undocumented worker, okay, you're here, you don't have papers. The law says you have the same protections as all other workers. So you're allowed to, you know, you work here, your employer is supposed to pay you, pay you at least a minimum wage. They're supposed to protect your health and safety. If you're injured on the job, you have access to workers' comp. That's what the law says. So yes, on paper, undocumented workers have those same rights. In reality, as you can probably imagine, it doesn't always work that way. It's really hard, actually, for undocumented workers to make sure that their employer is giving them those rights. Workers are often really, really afraid. Their employers may know that they're undocumented. They don't want to speak up if they see a problem in the workplace because the employer may threaten to call the authorities on them, have them deported. It can create very difficult situations for undocumented workers because, you know, they may recognize that there's problems on the job. And they may even know, legally I could go to the government and get these protections, but there's not a lot of people are very scared of that for a lot of reasons. You know, you don't want to threaten your status here in the States. You know, your well-being. People may have families that maybe been here for a long time. So it can be really hard. It can be a hard issue to have to navigate because you want to help people out, but you also have to really respect the fact that people have really serious fears a lot of times.
How did you become a health and safety expert?
So, how did I get into this? I mean, I studied when I was in college, I was studying a field called public health, which maybe some of you know about, sort of just protecting the health of the public. I actually was doing a lot on like homelessness health. I was really interested in homelessness and thinking about health issues related to homeless people and doing some work there. And I don't actually remember exactly. I think I was doing a project somewhere in school and that had something more to do with worker health and safety. And I got really interested in it because I really liked the idea that there's a way to prevent these injuries and illnesses. You know, there's laws in place for workers to prevent injuries and illnesses. It's not like homelessness where there's not really any laws to protect folks, and then you find people on the streets with these really crazy injuries and diseases. Here, the law at least is designed to try and prevent that stuff from happening. So that's how I got into it. I was really interested in that piece. The other thing, though, I was finding was, I started doing this work, and then all of a sudden, it's like I started thinking about my own family. I'm like, wait a second. I have a grandfather who worked in warehouses his whole career, and he was pretty much deaf from the noise he was exposed to there the whole time. I have another family member who was a firefighter and had these really serious burns because he was fighting a big fire in the cities where we grew up, and there weren't proper protections for those firefighters. And we never talked about it, right? I knew this as a kid growing up. I knew what these family members did, and I knew about those injuries, but no one ever said, hey, that could have been prevented. There should have been something in place to prevent that. So the other piece, which I've always thought about, is like these are issues which I think we all deal with in our families, maybe among ourselves, but it's often, we don't talk about them. We just assume, that's just the cost you pay. You go to work, hopefully you come home safe, hopefully you come home in the same state you left, but you don't, and you shrug. And I really feel strongly like, no, that's not the attitude we need to have. The attitude we need to have is our work should not cost our lives. Work should not cost our well-being. We all deserve to come home at the end of the day. And it shouldn't be just part of our job. It really needs to be something we are all fighting for. We're all paying attention to. We're all making sure that, every single one of us are safe and protected when we're on our jobs.
Well, it was a really fun time talking to Kevin and learning about workplace hazards. And one cool thing I learned about wage theft was that it usually happens in low-wage jobs, and you gotta look out for like your boss is not paying you overtime. And if you clock out, they might make you keep working, so they ain't gonna pay for you, or they ain't gonna pay you for that. So you gotta look out for that.
I feel like the most interesting part of the interview was the worker abuse story that he mentioned. It was a tight clothing factory that happened in the 1990s, and the workers were basically slaves and worked 17 hours a day.
And what I found interesting about the interview was the tips for the young workers. Yeah, and tips are like the bosses are gonna be different, and you're not always gonna have the same one. And just be safe in the workplace, because work could be dangerous. Check who your boss is when you're gonna go apply at a job, because you don't know if he can mess you over, and don't do something dangerous that if you don't feel like it's safe for you and your boss is trying to make you do it, then don't do that. So yeah.
This has been a really fun experience, like doing this program, going to UCLA, meeting new people, talking to Kevin.
Just learning new things and how to be safe in the workplace.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah, it was a fun experience, It just has been DJ Sentinel.
And DJ, you might get down.
With DJ Cheetah, signing
we're
out.
out.
Yeah, we're out of here.